So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where around the world that you are watching this, with whether you're joining us live. So, Benny, Jari, Mark, Nikita, Sil, and of course Marco. Thank you. But if you're watching it also on the recording, then I welcome you as well. We're really fortunate that we have our very special guest this morning, Marco Altini, to join us to talk about all things HRV and uh, and resting heart rate as well. We'll touch on some of that. Marco is world class in this space. He's PhD with honors in data science, masters of science with honors in computer science and engineering, masters of science with honors in human movement and high performance coaching. He's the founder of HRV for Training. He's guest lecturer at the University of Amsterdam. 10 years experience in modeling psychological data for health and performance, written 50 plus publications at the intersection between technology, health and performance. And he's a data science advisor for Oura as well. And just to put some context around it, a lot of the people on this call and be watching this call have an Oura ring and Muse or EEG related devices. So we're tracking our brainwave states through meditation throughout the day, but then also tracking a variety of different data points, HRV being one of them during the night. So it's really awesome to have you drop in with us here. So welcome and thank you, Marco.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Really glad to be here. Thank you for the introduction.
Amazing, man. It's yeah, so stoked to have you here. So I guess we'll just jump straight in. If you could start by just if you want to just do a little bit more, if there's anything from that intro that didn't touch on, maybe if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and why you got into this HRV space.
Yeah, sure. You covered pretty much everything, but yeah, I just have a technical background. I started more from the technology angle, and then after computer science, I got more fascinated, I guess, by data acquired from the human body. At that time was maybe 10, 12 years ago. It was a bit more difficult to do these things. So I ended up in a research institute where we would develop these prototypes to measure cardiac activity or stress response, even brain waves, and all sorts of systems that would not go to the consumer but would be then brought to the market by companies like Sony and Panasonic and all the big consumer electronics companies. And through that process, I guess I started to get more interested in physiological data. It was the right time. The first mobile phones were there, the first Android phone. You could start building something that people could actually use and not, only work with prototypes that stay within the company and, people never get to try. So started building the first apps linked to polar commercial sensors, and then developing that technology that uses, just the phone camera to measure HRV, so that it was just much easier for people to try these things and assess resting physiology. And then, from there, everything that you mentioned has been building up over the past years to try to help people basically experiment and better understand physiological responses, in particular to stress, and then, try to make adjustments and better balance stressors for health and performance.
Yeah, awesome, man. So why HRV? Like there's so many different data points that you can measure. So why you went deep into HRV? Could you maybe start by talking a bit more about that and then how it differs from resting heart rate and why HRV
Yeah, for sure.
better than resting heart rate as a measure?
Yeah, so both of them can give us different insights, but very broadly speaking, I would say HRV is a more sensitive metric to stress, and I think that's what maybe fascinates me the most. The way you can capture how the body responds to different stressors by using heart rate variability data, and that's again in general. And it's not that heart rate does not capture that, but typically in heart rate, you see that strong link only when you have fairly strong stressors. So, probably everybody that has been measuring for some time has noticed that, if you get sick, you have, I don't know, you have fever a couple of days, or your resting heart rate data, you can see it very clearly. You have a spike change that is, much different from what's your typical values. But then when you look at, let's say, more subtle stressors or, changes that you have on a day-to-day basis, things like that, they're not captured as well by heart rate. And we quantified also this through, the research that we do, looking at the relationship between, for example, training and the physiological response the day after in HRV and in resting heart rate. You could see even at the population level that typically after higher intensity sessions, you have maybe a change in heart rate, which is between 0.5, 1%. You have a change in heart rate variability, which is maybe 6, 8%. So it's just a more sensitive metric to capture stress response, and that's why it's more useful. That also makes it a bit more difficult to interpret sometimes, because we are just measuring basically the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, and that's anything affects your autonomic nervous system, which is why it's interesting to monitor, but also why it can get confusing if you don't do it in a certain way. And maybe later we can talk a bit about how you should be measuring your HRV so that the data you collect is representative of the stressors you're facing, more at the, let's say, at the chronic level, your resting physiology, more than just you had coffee 5 minutes ago, and that's pretty much irrelevant in the context of making changes.
Yeah, cool. And looking at the autonomic system, like, because we've been tracking data like through Oura predominantly, but I've been using the HRV for training, which is your app, most recently, just to sort of see how it compares. And it's amazing the similarities in the data that I'm getting, which is awesome. But then also, like, talking about the autonomic system, using meditation as a tool as well to regulate that state. So it is like we're in this stress pandemic. Like, the world is, we've collectively been through something that will change the face of the planet moving forward, and like having effective measures of stress and then how to regulate stress is just, I think, so important right then, more important than ever. So I get it, and that's one of the reasons for reaching out and really wanting to do a deep dive into HRV and how do we use it more as an effective tool, because I think there's a lot of myths around HRV, so it'd be great to sort of dispel some of those myths today as we go through this. But I guess if we can talk like for a moment about capturing effective data, from what I understand and reading some of your work, like morning and evening is best, or tracking it throughout the evening and then having a measure in the morning is most accurate. And HRV for training, it uses PPG. You'll be able to correct me in how to pronounce it, sorry. Which is just using your existing smartphone camera. And it's amazing how effective that is. I was blown away when I actually started using it. And that your tech, that measuring with a camera, it's been clinically verified against ECG and clinical grade ECG devices, but then also Polar H7 Bluetooth heart rate sensors. And Oura also uses like SSD to determine. And if you could explain some of this science for us, HRV.
For sure.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind just sort of maybe talking a little bit about HRV for training and Oura and what science they actually use to track the specific HRVs.
Yeah, for sure. So, the first thing is the technology used for the measurement. In this case, it's basically the same for both the camera-based measurement in the phone or the ring. Both use PPG. So it's basically, optical sensing. You just measure blood flow. In this case, even almost at the same location, you still do it at the finger. In our case, the fingertip. But that's typically the best place in the body for this kind of measurement. It tends to be less noisy than measuring at the wrist, for example. You get higher quality data. The principle is, of course, very simple. When your heart beats, blood flows, and you can capture that blood flow on the finger, because basically with the phone, what you do is through the flash, you can take a video of the skin, and the skin color changes slightly as the blood flows, and then you capture basically capture the signal which represents the heart beating, and from that you derive the beat-to-beat differences in heart rate variability, which is what is required to compute let's say the number that we get out of that. The number, you mentioned RMSSD, that's typically the feature that we all use these days, which is, I think, a great step forward with respect to the inconsistencies and all the issues that we have in heart rate variability literature, where all sorts of metrics have been used, which does not help much trying to understand what is happening and what are we measuring, what is a significant change in response to any stressor when we have lack of standardization in terms of measurements protocols and metrics used. Everything gets a bit complicated. But in the past few years, I think most people, both in academia and companies building sensors, started relying on this index because it's a simple and effective way to capture high frequency changes which reflect parasympathetic activity. So that's what is being measured by all of these tools, our tool, Oura, others, which means that a higher score typically means higher parasympathetic activity, so higher HRV, and that's in general a good thing, or at least it signals let's say that the part of the body that is in charge of recovery, rest, and relaxation is more active, while when this value gets lower, there is more stress on the body. So that's a bit how the measurement and the data point works. Then what is really key is when you capture this data point. So for apps and systems where you basically need to take a spot check measurement, then the best and possibly only way in which you should be doing that is first thing in the morning. And that's because first thing in the morning, all these other confounding factors that will affect the autonomic nervous system, even just light physical activity, coffee, any sort of psychological stressor, just reading something online that upsets you, everything has an influence on your autonomic nervous system, even just transitory. Sometimes it's a few minutes, then you're fine. You don't want to measure during that transitory stressor that is just influencing the measurement. You want to measure before any confounding factors. And that's why, typically first thing in the morning, you wake up, you're even still lying down in bed, before checking anything, take your measurement for 1 minute, and that's a great snapshot of your resting physiology. The only alternative to this, which makes sense doing, is to measure during the night. But even during the night, there are, let's say, better way to do this. So the Oura Ring, for example, uses the full night of data to give you the HRV of the night. And in my view, that's the best way to do it, because during the night, other factors might have an influence. Typically, this is a bit counterintuitive. People think, okay, I'm sleeping, that's the best. I'm unconscious. I cannot confound the measurement by, I don't know, thinking of something stressful, for example. But the thing is that it's not that simple, because during the night, there is the influence, for example, of the circadian rhythm. So, just the tendency of, your body recovering and HRV just going slightly higher over time, something you might have seen also in your data, or resting heart rate, just slightly reducing through the night. At the same time, there can be very high minute by minute differences in HRV because of sleep stages. That's actually how these sensors try to estimate sleep stages. It's because autonomic nervous system activity changes when you're in deep sleep, in REM sleep, and so on. So if we just take a few minutes here and a few minutes there, like, for example, sometimes an Apple Watch does, that tends to be inaccurate and not very representative of underlying physiological stress, just because you're getting a snapshot that might be influenced by these factors. And at that point, it's better to take that snapshot in the morning because you're not influenced by sleep stage and the circadian rhythm anymore. So there are many factors to consider, but in general, I think in this case, really the simplest way to do it, which is just to use the entire data and the average of the night, is the best way to get a representative
Cool, man. Sorry, just I dropped out a little bit towards the end there. So, but the summary is like the best way to do it, because of all the other contributing factors, is ideally during the evening or first thing in the morning, but during the night is more comprehensive, is what I sort of captured. And just talking a little bit like with HRV, so we're tracking the autonomic system and particularly the parasympathetic response, which is the, like you suggested, it's rest, it's recovery, but then the sympathetic response, because heart rate variability indicates that, you know, we have so many beats of our heart every minute, but there's not the same gap between. Could you just sort of, just so that everybody understands like how it actually works, if you could talk a little bit about that before we sort of drop more into.
Sure. Basically, you know, our heart rate, our heart does not beat at a constant frequency. So if we have 60 beats per minute, it's not going to be exactly every second. It's going to be, you know, maybe 1.2 seconds, 0.9 seconds, and there is always some variability. And it turns out that variability is modulated by the autonomic nervous system, in particular, the parasympathetic system and the vagus nerve, you know, innervate the heart and then modulate heart rhythm in a way that when parasympathetic activity is elevated, this variability between beats increases. And that's what is captured. That's also why you cannot have, let's say, an instantaneous measure of HRV. You need to collect some data, typically at least 1 minute for these measures, so that we can analyze these differences in this chunk of data and then estimate your HRV that way. And depending on what you are interested in, the measurement should be, you know, shorter or longer. But typically for this measure, RMSSD, that is reported both by our app and Oura and many other tools, you know, you can take a measurement as short as 1 minute, and that will be, you know, a good reflection of parasympathetic activity in that moment.
Yeah, cool. And from what I understand, like HRV, it's like an individual metric. It's pointless trying to compare it to somebody else's because we're all so different. And it's important to sort of map it against historical data over time. So can you talk a little bit about like interpreting HRV relevant to like our daily scores that we get, relevant to our like baseline average, which from what I understand is generally over a week or so, and then over in terms of like our longer term averages, and you know how Oura and HRV for training uses these to help us to optimize our performance?
Yeah, for sure. So indeed, you know, the first step, we talked about it, is you need to collect high quality data, and you have different ways to do that. But still, once you've done that, you know, what do you do with it? Because it's not as straightforward, especially because maybe it's a metric we're not used looking at. It's something that is not also that standard, you know, even in medical practice. And then, as you say, it's highly individual, right? So differences between people typically tell us very little, and even a lot less than resting heart rate in this context. For example, if we look at even just at you know, something very simple to analyze, if we look at endurance athletes, and typically something we can see very consistently is they would have a very low resting heart rate, right? Due to, you know, their fitness level, the training they do, and all of that. But their HRV, the absolute value, could be all over the map. So, you know, you could have relatively low values, relatively high values. The absolute value will not tell us anything about their performance. It is actually very weak, even the link between the absolute HRV value and VO2 max, for example, you know, another indicator of performance in these athletes. While with resting heart rate, if you take a large enough population, where you have differences, not just, a very narrow elite set of athletes, then you have a much stronger link. And that's because, HRV typically is something that is useful at the individual level in terms of basically making adjustments based on your own stress responses. But that means that we need to use this data to understand, what does it mean for you when a low score is, low enough that it signals that your body is more stressed, and when it's not. Because if we have looked at large differences, so we need to be able to determine what's what we could call a significant change, something that should trigger maybe some level of caution in terms of the training we're going to do, or the other stresses we might want to face that day, or if we want to give priority to recovery. So to do that, typically in sports science, but also in the tools we make, which again are maybe typically targeted for athletes, but it's just measuring physiology, so anyone could benefit from this kind of assessment. What we do is to build what we call the normal values of a person, which means that we use up to 2 months of data to determine what is the normal range in which your physiology normally is, assuming there is no stressor that basically takes your data outside of that normal zone. And when that's the case, say you face I don't know, some stronger stressors, so you have a negative response and you have a couple of low scores, and these scores are below what is considered your normal, that signals that you have a negative stress response, and that's a situation in which ideally you should try to give priority to recovery, or if you train, reduce training intensity, and basically take steps that prevent that negative situation to become chronic, so that you bounce back quickly. Basically, that's what you want to do. And yeah, that's what we do in the system. Typically in HRV for training, we use your past data to build this range of normal values, and then that way we do this kind of interpretation for you. And if on a given day your data is highly suppressed, below what is considered your normal, it can be flagged. At the same time, this allows you not to, let's say, so to speak, take too seriously changes that are not important, because there will always be changes. So if today my score is just a bit lower than yesterday, does that mean anything? Or is just normal day-to-day variations in physiology, and basically everything is normal? Because if we don't know this data well, it's difficult to quantify or to understand if this reduction that I have today is something I need to worry about or not. And that's how basically we handle this situation, by building this range of normal values, identifying values below that, and then providing tailored feedback basically on a day-to-day basis, so that you can try to act on that.
Yeah, cool. So I guess just so I'm clear, like this is how I sort of summarize it. So there's no point just doing spot checks of HRV periodically, particularly throughout the day, because there's so many other contributing factors. If you're going to measure it, you've got to measure it in the morning, ideally done overnight. But it's that buildup of your own individual data over time that gets it basically is learning you. And then from there, it works with a moving average, which is sort of generally within range of the normal, which is that historic data. But then you'll get day-to-day scores, and then if those scores, it could say if that's outside of that moving average and the normal, then it will trigger a response to say, hey, maybe you need to take it lighter today or take it easy today. Is that kind of generally?
Yeah, exactly. It's the way you act on you use the let's say the actionable advice on a day-to-day basis can be done in different ways, but the infrastructure, it's that you get the data, you build these normal values over 2 months, you have your baseline, which is 7 days moving average, so it's updated more quickly, right? It's just your very recent physiological baseline, so that could deviate from what is your normal when there is more stress,
and you might be traveling or something.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have your daily scores, and typically in research, we try to make changes based on the baseline. So, as soon as you have a low score, you don't make changes right away. Maybe you wait for the baseline to go below normal. So basically you wait a couple of days before you have a stronger stressor, and then you implement changes. But, that's because in research, you need to have some standardized rules so that you apply them, to a control group and to an intervention group, and then you see your in a systematic way any differences in the outcomes. But in real life, I would say that if you have an acute drop, a very low score one day, you have sick or any other strong stressor is present. So maybe you need to watch that too, right? So you don't want to make changes only when your baseline is below normal. If you have, a bad day, you have a bad day, and that can happen for, a series of reasons. Maybe just, bad dinner, something like that, that will influence your physiology and your ability to perform the following day. So, I think also the acute changes matter depending on context, and typically you as the one measuring and knowing yourself and what you did are the best person to decide, if that acute change is fine, you can ignore it, and tomorrow you'll bounce back, or if you should be a bit more cautious already in the first day.
Yeah, cool. And so what if somebody has like, so given they're all individual, if someone's got like chronic stress and they're going to build up a baseline normal, like a normal over say 2 months, which is in chronic stress, like how is then like HRV like an effective measure to help them on a more of a day-to-day basis if they're just stressed?
That's really a great question, because one very important thing to touch first is that when you start measuring, you just cannot know if you are already, if you're already in a period of chronic stress. The only thing you can do, if you feel like that could be the case, is to implement changes toward, a positive situation in which you're not anymore in that condition, and see if the data follows that kind of pattern. So that's one thing. Sometimes, we use a fairly long time frame, these 2 months, because I think that's a good trade-off between not adapting and changing your normal too quickly, which would happen if you were taking just a few weeks. Then maybe you face some stronger stressors for a couple of days, and the system starts thinking that's your normal. Well, that should not be the case. So it should be fairly long. At the same time, you don't want to keep it too long for various reasons. One is, if you're in a situation of more chronic stresses, a long time ago, that's not your normal anymore. But there is also some seasonality in the data. So you don't want to, maybe in summer you have better values, for example. You don't want to be stuck with normal values from 6 months ago, but we need to have some trade-offs in there. And that's why we use these 2 months. But still, there is the issue of, when you start collecting data and you don't know exactly where you are. If your lifestyle has not changed much, typically that's a good way to get a snapshot, and then over time you will learn. Typically, we recommend always, just to collect data for a fair amount of time so that you see how your body responds to various stressors, and that starts to give you an indication of how things are trending. And if you are in a bad period of chronic stress for various reasons, maybe you have a health condition, or maybe I don't know, you're just an acute health condition, so just sick for some reason, or you have I don't know, some strong maladaptation to some stressor, training or work related. So let's say a sort of overtraining or burnout, but just not a very strong one that would impair your condition for years to come, but just a couple of bad weeks. Still in that let's say suppressed parasympathetic system situation and low HRV, there will be changes on a day-to-day basis. So that's how I think you can still try to make use of the data, is basically in finding the better and worse days in a situation that overall is not particularly good. So you just have, a a different situation to work with, but you can use it. You can use the data to basically balance things a bit better, make small adjustments. Normally I would train maybe daily and go for my runs, and data would be stable. And then recently I had a period in which my health wasn't great. Several days the data is suppressed, then it starts to pick up again. But then as soon as maybe I do a little more, I have an acute drop again. So while I'm not back where I was, and while I'm also better than I was in the very worst acute phase, still the data takes from the stressor. The acute drop after an intense stressor is much stronger than it was before. It's just your body is going through a recovery phase, and every day, every week is a bit different. So you can still use that information, I think, as awareness on, okay, I'm getting better, but I did this and I see the drop right away. So now again, I take another break, and then I take this another couple of days, and it's just day-to-day stress management, basically.
Yeah, I think some people lose sight of sometimes that this is like it's biofeedback, right? And like they think this, like just by working with a figure, it's it's a fix all. It's not even so much about the figure, really. From what I understand, like really what these data points indicate is that how we need to take a more of a holistic approach to life. Like there's upstream factors that contribute to the fact that we may be getting like a really bad HRV score ongoing, which is like not getting effective rest and sleep, and maybe drinking too much alcohol at night, which can then affect your HRV. Maybe not having a meditation, a practice, eating the wrong foods at the wrong time. These are all sort of things that can impact on our like HRV or our recovery and how we show up the next day, of which HRV is an indicator of. But I hear people talking about, like doing things to hack their HRV. Like, what's your thoughts on this sort of as a context? Because I know we talked about, like the normal, which is the more like up to, say 2 months of value. Then you've got your floating average, which is indicative of like your ongoing daily scores as an average. Are there things that we can do outside of good lifestyle practice that can help improve our HRV, maybe like saunas or stuff like that?
Yeah, I think that it's difficult and complicated, because indeed what we measure is just rest. If you measure it, in that context that we discussed, night or morning, it's just resting physiology, and it's not that easy to alter it. That's why what works typically is lifestyle, and also it works again typically if your lifestyle is not great. You know how it is, right? You make changes, and then many parameters in the body will improve, including your HRV. But if you are already healthy and you eat well, you take care of yourself, you take care of your sleep, you exercise, and you do all of that, then it could be that your baseline HRV, your chronic values, more or less, that's what it is, because much of it is driven also by genetics. So it's not something that we can easily change. And yeah, that's why in general, I think it is such a great metric for day-to-day adjustments and understanding stress, how that changes, over months and so on, but in a way that, there will be fluctuations around what is your value. And to change your baseline and improve your HRV, once you've addressed all the typical lifestyle aspects, and as well as chronic stressors. Sometimes I hear people and they are exercising and eating well and everything, but maybe you're also I don't know, an extremely stressed CEO of a company, and you address everything, but at the same time your life is stress. So maybe that's the elephant in the room. It's very difficult then to make changes there. And things like mindfulness, meditation, biofeedback, anything where you basically try by deep breathing to strengthen the parasympathetic system, that's something that could be an effective training. At the same time, it is clear that there is an acute effect, even maybe saunas or these other techniques where you might have an acute positive effect as you do it. But the challenge then is to see if that change is actually brought basically to your baseline physiology, because that will be, and it doesn't mean that that's the only thing that matters, because while you do those things, you might feel better. Psychologically, you might have benefits. You might deal better with anxiety and all sort of other things. But it does not mean that necessarily it will have an influence. And that can happen in many people, but it's not something that you can be certain about, even if you try to address all of these issues and meditate a lot. We've just launched a biofeedback tool, for example, which works just by basically guiding you through a deep breathing exercise. And I was just looking at the data just last week to see, for example, would people that practice this manage to improve their HRV as measured during the session? So still acutely, but it's a standardized context because you always breathe in the same way. So while you do it, would your HRV improve over time? And something we could see is, for example, that people that were new to the practice, that never did it before, they experienced quite large changes. So they were able to basically improve their HRV as they practice. While people that came to the tool as people that already meditated or did biofeedback, that knew all these techniques, maybe for years, there will be no change because maybe they already went through that change that happens as you pick it up, but then not necessarily continues as you keep doing it. And again, there might be other benefits to the technique, but not necessarily is impacting anymore your resting physiology. It's always many factors at play.
Yeah, cool. I'll just let everybody know that we'll throw to questions soon. So if you've got questions, I see Sil's put some into the chat. That's awesome. I also wanted to acknowledge Brian from Oura, who was on. I think he maybe had to go, but Brian was on, and I know I'm pretty sure that you're connected to Brian at Oura, of course. Yeah, I like. I'm relatively new to HRV, but I have a deep appreciation for it now because it's measuring, that the autonomic system, which is like, stress, our rest and recovery, and measuring it particularly when we're at rest. So it's a really good indicator of our stress when we should be essentially at rest, which is really powerful. You touched on like acute stresses and more long-term chronic stresses. I just wondered if you maybe could talk a little bit about that before we throw to questions from everybody else.
Yeah, sure. Normally, when we talk about acute stressors, we mean anything that affects your physiology and has an impact that lasts between maybe 24, 48 hours. You can think about high intensity training, again, alcohol, getting sick, traveling. These factors, tend to have an acute strong effect on your physiology, and then, you bounce back normally rather quickly. So let's say these acute drops that still we should be mindful of, but that do not trigger longer term changes typically, unless we do that extremely frequently, right? Then it becomes maybe even chronic. While on the chronic side, we look more at changes that are maybe linked to positive adaptation to training. Think about, training plan leading to a competition, months of, workouts, and how your body responds to all of that, not just on a day-to-day basis, but, you want to see stable or increasing HRV as you increase load, signals of, signs of good body responses, and everything that basically happens in the time frame of weeks to months. That's what we normally consider. And when that's where the the visualizations we have with the normal values and baselines become more useful, because they allow you to better understand what happened in a period that is much longer than the typical day-to-day that we always examine, because that's what we see first thing in the morning when we get the data. But then retrospectively, typically looking at the longer time frame can be more informative also to understand how you responded to doing this or that.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Just a quickie from Nikita. What was the name of the biofeedback tool that you mentioned?
So it's called HRV for biofeedback. So we have the other app is called HRV for training, and this one specifically for biofeedback is called HRV for biofeedback. It allows you to measure also with the camera, which is a good way to start. That we recommend, polar straps. They work great, provide high quality data, and biofeedback is something normally you put in, fit in your routine during the day. It's a bit different from the body measurement, where typically people dislike wearing sensors and the chest strap because it's a bit uncomfortable first thing in the morning, but it typically is quite okay later when you have that routine, the same way you would do a workout. You do your breathing session and take it from there.
Yeah, cool. I really love with your HRV for training, like you can actually see your pulse in the camera in the light. It's like, wow, this is really cool. Yeah. Still, I just thought I'd pop you up. Hope that's okay, and you're decent, so that you could ask Marco your questions.
Hi, Marco.
Hey.
Let me see what my questions were. And where shall I start? Yeah, is there a relation with the brain waves and HRV?
So yes, let's say that everything is connected between the brain and the heart. That's also why, for example, we try to estimate sleep stages from activity collected, from the Oura ring, which is just measuring the autonomic nervous system activity, but that is relating to different sleep stages that typically are actually measured in the brain, right? Actually, that's the way you would measure if we had, comfortable technology that would allow to measure brain waves, eye movement, and all of that. So yeah, certainly interactions, different processes, I would say. It's not that, I think when it comes to HRV, we really need to contextualize it well and understand, what are we interested in? What we are interested in is the main question, because there are like no universal guidelines for anything. For example, you want to see how a stressor very specific affects you. Maybe you want to measure before and after. But if you want to see how your body responds in general to lifestyle stressors and anything else that is happening in your day, then the night and the morning is best. So there is always different considerations to make depending on the very specific context and processes you're interested in.
The way I see it is as well, like when we are in a period of stress, obviously our heart rate's beating more and our often in a high beta brain frequency, and using meditation as a tool, we can regulate out of that sympathetic fight-flight state into more of the parasympathetic state. And so in a waking state, it's probably going to adjust your heart rate variability, just as an acute, I guess, looking at it as an acute stressor. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a scientist at all, but I was thinking if positive affirmations can increase coherence and HRV. We also do know that those states are related to certain brain waves. That would make sense to me.
I see your point. I think when it comes to coherence and let's say, well, that's basically RSA, so just changes in cardiac activity as you do deep breathing. The main contributor, I think, it is the breathing itself. But yeah, certainly, you know, the central nervous system is where many of these things starts, right? And then, you know, the vagus nerve innervates the heart. So there are, yeah, quite obvious links still between the two. And yeah, I don't think we have even the full picture on, you know, many of these interactions.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I was also interested in where do you think the science and the research of HRV is going? What are the newest insights, or
Yeah, good question.
how
So
will it develop?
I think, yeah, we made a lot of progress into measuring, assessing HRV, to the assessment part. Something where maybe we know a lot less is how can you influence it? And we talked about it briefly before, you know, like, okay, main lifestyle changes can have an impact, but maybe other techniques, and you know, what is more fascinating to me, maybe also because we started building these tools, is again linked to breathing, biofeedback, or, you know, meditation, anything that is these techniques that still acutely impact the parasympathetic nervous system and maybe are strengthening it as you do it. How can that change or impact positively your resting physiology? If it doesn't, why is that? Why it does work for some people and not for everyone? You know, many of the complexity of a positive intervention, I think, is where we will learn more now that we have better technology to assess, and we have, you know, better technology to experiment. Hopefully we can learn a bit about that and take some useful takeaways for people to better manage stress, but also influence positively resting physiology.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one more question if there's time,
yeah.
but
Go for it. So yeah.
Oh yeah. I know besides me, there are some people in this group right now who work with HeartMath breathing. Do you know HeartMath breathing? Are you?
Yeah.
Can you maybe give your perspective on what HeartMath is doing, and yeah, what the data does tell or doesn't tell, or yeah.
So I think, you know, this is basically the same as the biofeedback we talked about earlier. So guided breathing, typically around your resonant frequency. I don't know if they estimate your resonant frequency or if it is always 6 per minute, but, you know, still it's close enough to most people's resonant frequency. And, you know, that's a method to strengthen parasympathetic activity. Again, improving HRV for sure, with respect to resting condition acutely as you do it. Then the question is, you know, does this have long-lasting effects? How much practice do you need to do? You know, typically the original biofeedback protocols are, I think, 2 sessions of 20 minutes per day. So, you know, it's a decent dose of breathing. And, you know, still, I would say, up for debate if there are then positive changes from a physiological point of view, because still it is more proven that psychological changes and management of, you know, anxiety, depression, and all of that is improved by biofeedback techniques. So many aspects, but still, I think the overall principle of doing biofeedback and deep breathing is certainly an interesting area to explore, and HeartMath has done a lot of work there for a very long time. Yeah.
Thanks, Sil. Thanks, Marco. I just Benny has a question, so I wanted to invite Benny to ask his question, if that's okay.
Thanks for those questions, Sil. They're awesome. And cheers, Marco. This has been really enlightening. Thanks to Troy for putting this on. Yeah, I am fascinated just by checking out, and I did a little bit of a Google onto your blog about that study that you've just done. I was just thinking as you were talking through it, perhaps this is the reason why when people first discover deep breathing, let's say Wim Hof, the Wim Hof craze, they get this this immediate like froth factor and like, I've just had this revolutionary change within myself for multiple reasons. So I think this research that you're doing is epic to quantify that and the importance of getting people breathing deeper, faster. So thank you very much. I'm keen to continue to research. One question I do have is, I've been in rooms discussing HRV with pretty switched on people, and not myself directly explaining it. It's not totally my jam. That's why I'm here to learn more. And I've just seen the blank faces come back when you're explaining, you know, what HRV is. I was wondering if you have a banging metaphor or use case story that you would use to tell a kid what HRV is, or a grandma, or no offense to grandmas, but you know, what would be your way to explain it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know, honestly, something that comes to mind, you know, I don't know. Just thinking about blood pressure. I use this a lot in the context of the fact that people, you know, for a long time, everybody has said that your HRV should be higher, while I'm really trying to say and, you know, tell people your HRV should be normal. You know, you shouldn't go outside of what's your normal. And we all understand more or less that high blood pressure is bad, low blood pressure is bad, and your blood pressure should be normal in some range. So that's something I use a lot for HRV, more in the context of interpreting the data, more than in what HRV is. In what it is, you know, physiological stress, but then we repeat all the talk, and I don't know if I have a better way to say that. I'll give it some thought, though it's certainly a good pointer for me.
Mate, it could be a collective thing that we all work on as a group here, to work out that one. Yeah, for me, I feel like my HRV stays pretty good, but then my sleep is the thing that kicks me in the butt. And then my HRV, unless I'm starting to feel sick, that's when I notice that it's out of whack, and I use Oura. I'm looking forward to giving your app a try as well. Yeah, I'm actually, I guess, where does CO2 come into all of this? That would be my question, because I do a bit of work and I've created a protocol around how to measure CO2 max, which is essentially using box breathing, scaled box breathing. And so every time you go around a box, you increase by a second. And then wherever you tap out, that's what we're calling at the moment a CO2 max. And so we're working with different sports clubs and teams to go like, okay, well, if you're landing there, then we can use other slower breathing techniques and other breathing techniques to improve your CO2 tolerance and your CO2 max score. And we're hoping, and we've seen early results, that this will improve someone's overall health and performance output. So if you could riff a little bit, yeah.
No, I'm thinking just, you know, that maybe it's not something that even has been measured or analyzed systematically so far, even how these techniques impact your physiology from that point of view. So yeah, if you run studies, maybe add the data point, and that's something that we can learn from.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I'll probably try and get your details off Troy and shoot you over the protocol. I'll see what you think.
Yeah, please feel free. Drop me an email and I can always try to comment.
Thanks, mate. Thanks, team.
All right. Any other nuggets of wisdom, Marco, before we let you go? I'll do a bit of a wrap up, but any other sort of insights that you thought? Wisdom.
I think this was great chat, you know, from the basics to the data, and a lot of great questions on other aspects linked to breathing and all of that. I think it's really fascinating, and something we really need to understand better. So it's great to see so many people into it.
Yeah, I think as a protocol, it is, like Benny mentioned, sometimes hard to grasp, but reading your stuff, and I want to encourage you to check out Marco's his blogs, his website, HRV for Training. Get the app, have a play with it. It's I think it's about $12 or something like that. It's pretty inexpensive. It's a great tool. It does measure your HRV, like it's that morning data point. So we sort of talked about the key times to actually capture HRV, which is resting during the night and first thing in the morning as soon as you wake up, and ideally in the same position at the same time. And essentially what HRV we're tracking is the parasympathetic response, making sure that that's active, that's healthy. So it's indicative of not being in stress. If the sympathetic system as part of the autonomic system is firing too much, it would indicate that we're in a stress state. And so HRV is essentially measuring how our recovery is based on those resting measures of our heart rate variability. And there's acute stresses that impact us day to day, but there's also more chronic stuff. And ideally, as individual data, we want to take it, we want to build up a normal range, which is about 2 months. But then there's a floating average, which is in about a week, as far as I understand from reading your stuff, Marco. But then there's like the day-to-day measures, which will slowly start moving that average, which then could slowly start moving your norm based on the day-to-day data. But ideally, like to really impact on our HRV, it's really about looking upstream and going, all right, what is this day-to-day data indicative of? If, you know, I am that CEO and my day is filled with stress, you know, like we know now there's a growing body of evidence how chronic stress and how sleep or deprivation around sleep and just being in this sympathetic stress response ongoing can shorten our lives and, you know, predispose us to chronic diseases. And, you know, like this is an awareness, it's a wake-up call for some people to go look upstream. Is this the life that you actually want to live? Or do you want to make some changes now? Do you want to be the CEO constantly stressed, or do you want to, you know, maybe go out to the farm? Well, it's just like it's a feedback, right? At the end of the day that we can use. So I'm not sure if I missed anything, but
yeah, that's great. You know, it starts with awareness, and that's, I think, really the most important bit. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate you. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Great to have this chat. It'd be great to, you know, get you back at some point in the future and sort of share where we're at. Want to share your work with our audience now and as it continues to grow. So thanks for taking the time out to be here. And thanks everybody else for tuning in, whether you're watching this live or or the recording at some point in the future.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, guys. Big love.